Hello, I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. Thank you for joining us as we explore the exciting advancements in technology-enabled collaboration to excel important drug development. Vibe Bio seeks to find every cure for every community. We think big as no one should be left behind in the pursuit of living a healthy, happy, and productive life, free from disease. Collectively, we have the skills, we have the technology, and we have the passion. We now need the community catalyst to bring it all together. That's Vibe. We see a future where communities of biopharma experts and patients collaborate to identify high potential medicines and have the ability to access capital on demand to actually develop them. The VibeCast is our weekly informational podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development and technology innovation with some of the dynamic people that make up the Vibe community. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is none other than Dr. Wendy Charles. I've actually known Wendy since I think 2018 or so, and I've followed her work as she pushes health IT forward with her research on emerging technology. Dr. Charles currently serves on the European Union Blockchain Observatory and Forum Expert Panel. She's also on the HIMSS Blockchain Task Force, Government Blockchain Association Health Group, and the IEEE Blockchain Working Groups. Wendy, so good to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I forgot to mention that you're also Chief Scientific Officer of BurstIQ, and you're a faculty, adjunct faculty at University of Colorado, Denver, and University of Denver.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great.
The topic for today, folks and audience members, is real-world data and what are its implications in a Web3 world. All right, Wendy, I'll let you have the floor just to kind of introduce yourself a little bit and have the audience get to know you, and then we'll go into some questions.
Well, thank you. So I am so thrilled to talk about this area. This is an aspect of true passion for me. I've been involved in clinical research for over 30 years. And I spent half of that time in regulatory compliance and the other half in operations. So when we talk about research, development, capturing data, I think about what it was like to sit across from research participants, to be in healthcare environments, often conducting research on people who were very ill, very vulnerable. And then, so a big part of that component is the ethics of how are we actually trying to advance healthcare. And when we capture data about an individual, that's a real person who has family, who is sensitive about the use of their information. Spending the other half of my career in regulatory compliance, I had served as a director of research regulatory affairs. I was also an IRB director for 8 years. And so I also think about things from a regulatory standpoint as to what's permitted. And so I hope that I can infuse the conversation today with the combination of what are the goals of advancing healthcare research with real world data, but how does this also represent a person? And also what is possible within the regulatory framework today?
Excellent. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. So let's start by asking you, what is real world data? And then why is it important to healthcare and research?
Yeah, thanks. So real-world data pertains to a person's health status or well-being, and that can include the care received by that person when collected in real-world settings. So I'm going to provide some comparisons to explain how this is different than we often conduct research. So the first is that in a clinical trial, we often enroll the healthiest individuals that have the disease that we're studying. And they may have a limited number of medications, a limited number of comorbidities. But in a real world setting, people take medications that may have that may be confounded by a number of other medications that they're taking, or they may have a number of health conditions. And so in a real world setting, it's important to know how medications actually used and how people experience it when they do take other medications and other health conditions. And a big complication that we face in the real world settings too is that people are not nearly as compliant with their medications or their treatment regimens as they would be in a clinical trial when they are under close supervision.
That's a really good point.
So the next component too is it's much more valuable to capture how a person's functioning in their day-to-day experience as opposed to taking a snapshot of their experience in a doctor's office or a clinical trial. And we think about white coat hypertension. Some people get nervous right before they get their blood pressure measured in a doctor's office. or their laboratory readings on that day might not be reflective of how they're actually doing. So it's much more important to capture someone's functioning over time to understand how they are experiencing their condition or their treatment in real world settings. And the last reason that pertains to real world data is thinking about how treatments or medications are used off label. In fact, one estimate published in JAMA was that up to 20% of medications are prescribed off-label. And just as an example for our audience, a drug called quetiapine, its brand name Seroquel, was approved by the FDA for treatment of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but it's used very widely in lower doses for insomnia. But the challenge is, unless we study this drug in real world settings, we don't know how well it works for insomnia. And it's just important to have a broader picture and more accurate data about how people are functioning and how they are using the treatments in their day-to-day experiences. So I wanted to capture too, you asked about why this is important. And so there's a couple reasons for that too. So the first really pertains to what VibeCast is focused on, and that's really creating patient-centered focuses on how medications are developed, because real-world data can capture the type of information that's most important to patients, and that's the quality of life. That's what patients care about and what our society cares about. So for some examples of the differences, physicians often prescribe really expensive statins, and the goal is to lower cholesterol, and physicians consider it successful if they get a reduction of, let's say, 5 milligrams per deciliter. But a patient won't feel that difference. And what patients care about is whether they will live longer, or whether the medication will help them avoid a stroke or a heart attack, or simply just feel better.
Right, feel better.
And so a primary goal then is, how do we collect outcomes that are more meaningful to the patients, the factors that impact their real life circumstances? So as an example of a study that was really meaningful to me and helped me understand the importance of real world data was a study in 2016 about congestive heart failure. And most of the time, congestive heart failure is diagnosed with echocardiograms at a healthcare facility, and those are important objective measures. But what patients really care about is whether they can attend their grandson's birthday party. And so this particular study asked patients with congestive heart failure to wear a GPS tracker to see how much more often they were leaving their home and living a more independent life with this medication, rather than just taking laboratory measurements. And I really think that that exemplifies what we are really trying to achieve with real world data and real world evidence, is how does this impact a person's experience in the real world? And when we design studies like this, I am thrilled that there's a lot more effort to include patients in the design of these studies so that they can provide a voice about what outcomes actually matter to them and how they hope that a treatment would make a difference in their lives. So that's the patient perspective. Other aspects pertain to—
Really quick, I just
Yeah.
want to jump in and say, like, I think, you mentioned a few examples, and one other example I can think of, maybe you're going to mention this, but when a company works on a clinical trial and they're trying to get their drug approved, they're really trying to narrow their patient population so that the drug is approved in many cases. So their inclusion and exclusion criteria are very specific. That's not capturing the actuality of the patient population in the real world, right?
That's correct.
So that's, and it's sometimes biased, right? Like, as we're saying. So I think that's another key part of how, real world data can get a better picture of how these drugs actually work in people. So just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and this is the type of data that's captured also in population health studies. It's an entire element of research involving pragmatic research, also health services research, studying the value of healthcare, and they study population level healthcare. So what they capture is the data that are already available, most often from electronic health records, but it can also be from patient wearables, in order to get a population level assessment and compare to costs. And I think we're seeing a huge explosion right now in the emphasis on real-world data toward real-world evidence is the FDA's emphasis on this now.
Mhm.
And so even in 2021, the FDA issued 3 draft guidance documents that guide researchers about how to capture and manage real-world data more effectively so that they could be submitted as part of an application to modify the approved indication for a drug or to augment a new drug application. So I'm very encouraged that this is the direction that we're going with many aspects of healthcare.
That's excellent. So what are some of the actual sources of real world data? We mentioned a few, but I'd love to dig in more.
Yeah. So if we think about different sources of information that pertain to somebody's health, there's really no limit. So some of the most common, of course, electronic health records is one of the richest sources of health information, and it's often widely available, not just to researchers, but they are actually being sold in many cases as part of data marketplaces. We'll talk about that more in
You're
a
right,
bit.
with or without our permission, right? I
Yeah.
guess.
And so other sources involve like mortality data. These are death records. It can be specific cause or all cause mortality, laboratory results, prescription information obtained by pharmacies. Claims databases are really common. Disease registries could be medical devices and could be medical grade or consumer grade. Smartphone apps are increasingly used to capture real-world data as well. And one aspect of capture for real-world data that many people don't think about is the ability to scrape social media posts.
Mm.
When I worked at Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Center, our team was hired by pharmaceutical companies to see how people were posting about their opioid use. And it was only from some of these social media posts that we learned how about supply and demand as affected by the street price of opioids, and also how people were posting about how they were defeating the enteric coatings for extended release medications. And so even social media posts can be a valuable source of real world data.
Very interesting. That's true. And I think that's going to become increasingly more important as everyone start to, either consume or produce content online. Very interesting. And I'm sure it helps with, opioid crisis, as well as other mental health issues, suicide prevention, and things like that as well.
Agreed.
Very interesting. And not only that, even like, for example, COVID, right? Like when people in a specific community or region start Googling or even researching or posting that they have COVID or they're looking it up, that's data as well that can be leveraged to understand the population's health. Yeah.
Google researchers often claim that they can detect an outbreak of disease before the public health researchers can.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So how reliable are some of these sources, specifically thinking about the consumer grade products, Apple Watch, Fitbits? I got a Garmin. I love it.
Yeah.
Not a commercial, everybody, but I do enjoy the digital watches.
This is a really important topic to consider because we are generating data in all of the activities we do, from our internet searches, as you described, from the wearables that we wear, and from all of our healthcare visits. So just first talking about electronic health records, since that was our focus earlier. When I did my dissertation research on medication accuracy, and I developed a tool at the time to help patients track their medication use more effectively. One of my committee members had pointed out that a person's electronic health record becomes inaccurate as soon as they walk out the door. And a part of that, and reflecting back on some research that Kaiser Permanente had done, that up to 30% of patients don't even fill the prescription that they were given. And so the health record may or may not reflect a person's actual behavior. Other research done in the United Kingdom on NHS records has reflected that up to 40% of their patient records are inaccurate. Most of the time just incomplete. So electronic health records themselves, which is a huge source of real world data, may involve some inaccuracies and shouldn't be considered completely reliable. The next, we rely heavily on the medical devices that we wear, but not all of them have been validated. So it's important to distinguish between a medical grade device and a consumer grade device. So I am wearing an Apple Watch. This is not an advertisement. And it's important to know that because Apple focuses on its EKG capabilities and more of its health-related information delivery, that Apple obtained 3 clearances from the FDA to track and report information pertaining to atrial fibrillation. So for some indications, this is actually an FDA approved, cleared device and constitutes medical grade information. Most of what we use, though, to track our health is consumer grade. These are apps that help us figure out how many steps we take, what is our heart rate over the day, how well did we sleep, for example. And unless those have been validated by testing them against accurate medical grade devices, the information that they generate is unknown. And I recall a family that talked to me about how they got a great deal on a spirometer to monitor on Amazon to monitor their child's asthma. And I said, well, what does it describe about the FDA review or clearance? And they said it says not to be used for diagnostic purposes, not reviewed by the FDA. And the challenge is then that if something didn't go through the process to compare it and study it against information that we know to be valid and reliable, then we just don't know how accurate the results are. In some cases, the information from devices that we buy on the internet might not be any more reliable than that of a toy. So it's important that we only place trust in information that at least has undergone enough study that we can trust that the information means what we think it means. And so it is important for us as patients and consumers to be much more mindful about the rigor of the study that that's undertaken in order to establish meaning for any devices that we use. And the last thing to consider, most people don't realize that even the databases themselves need to undergo some form of rigor. So the FDA actually has specific requirements for database systems that are used in preparation for an application to the FDA. And those databases have to be protected against tampering. They have to make sure that when data are transferred between systems, that they're not altered in any way, that data are not lost in any way. And so I'm not talking about FDA regulation of an electronic health record. Those have different forms of certification, but we are talking about what happens to the data after it leaves an electronic health record system. How are the data in a database protected so that we can ensure that they have sufficient integrity for later submission to the FDA?
Great points. I think that's really important to point out. And, even though many of the consumer grade devices are not validated or cleared by the FDA, it doesn't mean that individuals themselves can't use them in order to at least create a baseline for themselves and just monitor how they're doing over time. You shouldn't use that information to make any medical decisions necessarily, but at least it's good for them to be able to measure something and see how that changes over time, and hopefully motivates them to either get healthier or something. So, but I see your point 100%.
That's a good point. Those are typically classified as wellness devices, and they can be used for information, education, sometimes even entertainment. So there can still be uses.
Awesome. So now that we've talked about where the sources of this data is coming from, let's talk about who owns this data, actually, because there's so many different headlines telling us that the data that we have in our EHR systems or even in our apps and devices are getting sold, like you mentioned earlier, to different marketplaces, sometimes without our knowledge. So many times. So tell us who owns the data.
So starting out, who owns the data about us as patients or consumers? And, there are a lot of different parties that claim a sense of ownership. And first and foremost, app developers. Think about the Apple Watch we were just talking about, or your Garmin. Some people think, well, it's data about me. I own it, right? Think again. It's processed by Apple, it's processed by the app manufacturer, and they are the ones who are actually selling it. When we also think about other entities that claim some sort of ownership, providers believe it's their intellectual property because it was their clinical judgment that led to a diagnosis and data in an electronic health record. Or how about healthcare facilities that pay for the electronic health record system, and they're the ones who maintain it? How about insurers? They're the ones who pay for the healthcare visits. Electronic health record vendors such as Cerner, Epic, Allscripts, etc. Cerner has actually been selling our health records since 1999. And then how about pharmaceutical companies that either pay for clinical studies, which could involve longer term data capture, or they could be purchasing data sets from any number of data brokers. And so possession often is interpreted as being 9/10 of the law. And so then there's a number of different entities that really believe that they own information about patients. So a challenge that we face when it comes to electronic health record ownership is that each state in the US has a different process for how they have either regulated or managed electronic health record ownership. And a reason why some states have given explicit legal ownership to healthcare facilities or providers is because they have enduring regulatory responsibilities to protect and maintain that information so that data will be available for continuity of care. And in some states, they have to retain records for many years. In Vermont, I believe, they have to retain immunization records forever. So if they have this regulatory responsibility to protect the information, it was then given to them the legal ownership. So this graph shows the states in which there is a specific statute granting legal ownership to a hospital or physician for the electronic health record. And for the gray states, there is no state that confers specific legal ownership, but it's important to consider that when a healthcare facility is sold, the intellectual property and the data, often the electronic health record system, is sold as part of that transaction. And in those cases, the electronic health record information constitutes property that is sold as part of that transaction. And so in those cases, then it's still considered part of the facility that had owned or maintained it. Now, only one state thus far in the United States has put into statute that a patient owns the medical record, but it's even more complete. It's New Hampshire, but
It's not that clear, I guess, right?
Well, the challenge is a patient can't just walk into a hospital in New Hampshire and say, I'm here to take away my medical record.
Give me my data. No.
They can get access to it, but they can't walk away with their chart because those facilities are still responsible for maintaining the record for continuity of care for a period of time. So this is the landscape of legal ownership. So in some cases, it's helpful for us to consider when talking about real world data, the difference between an electronic health record ownership and the data in the records, or also the legal ownership versus control.
One quick question, sorry to interrupt you, but in New Hampshire, for example, are these companies or hospitals able to sell the patient's medical information? Because technically, according to the law, patients own their own information. So are they still able to sell it with some, through some sort of other statute or something?
I am afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, well, we can follow up. If anyone listening in on YouTube or something would love to get more information on that, so please.
Excellent.
Let us know.
Okay. So we are seeing some trends, and I think it's really interesting for us to talk about how the landscape is changing. So, we had to fight for years just to get access to our own healthcare records. And then it wasn't until there were actions from the Office of the National Coordinator of Health Information Technology to force greater interoperability, to force healthcare organizations to allow patients to view and be able to share some of their health records more easily. And as we're seeing a change in the privacy statutes as well, the privacy statutes, and so there are 5 US states thus far that have GDPR-like privacy statutes that enable a consumer to have much more control over information about them. So it doesn't, there are some exceptions for healthcare, but what we're seeing is when these consumer privacy trends are expanding, then we see the applicability expanding. And so as individuals want to have more control, visibility and control over their information, we are seeing a shift in how this is taking place. And quite honestly, we at BurstIQ believe that the trend is increasing so that in a number of years, not immediately, but in a number of years, individuals will probably have more rights to profit and even sell their information themselves.
I hope so. And I think, first of all, I love this graph. And I think there's going to need to be like a, critical mass of people that want this. I don't think that exists yet. And I think it's maybe because of lack of education about it, or just lack of awareness, or they don't care about it. But when they do care about it is when they find out someone else is making money by selling their data, and that kind of triggers them. So there's probably it'll take some time for all of this to, disperse into the communities. I do see this trend happening though, eventually.
And I completely agree, Ray. And we don't expect states or companies to require that their data become much more available and give individuals the right to profit or sell right away. Right. But I believe it's important for companies and healthcare environments to be forward-thinking and evaluate what the trends are and ensure that their data systems allow them to track the uses of individuals' data so that they can give more visibility and control, especially for those non-healthcare purposes, such as marketing and use in repositories, for example, that may not be directly related to treatment. To how can we ensure that our technology is flexible enough so that it can meet the trends that we believe will come in the future.
Exactly. I'm with you there. Awesome. So we talked a little bit about, who owns the data, who profits from real world data as well. So how much control do patients have of their real world data now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because there are so many organizations that claim control and believe that they should profit from sales or uses of electronic health records, consumer information. And so it's right now, individuals actually don't have much visibility or control of how their information is being used. Now, part of it is due to, in my opinion, kind of antiquated practices. For example, when Cerner started selling electronic health records in 1999, most patients didn't even have the internet. And personal computers were expensive, and we certainly didn't walk around with a computer every day in our hands. Right. So some of the practices are reflecting an older time period, and it's traditionally difficult to get organizations to adopt a new mindset about how they manage data. So right now, many of these organizations are making decisions about individuals' health information without their visibility or control, and therefore they're also profiting without an individual's control. So I'm going to paint two sides of the issue just to help clarify some of the nuances and difficulties for the audience. So being a researcher myself, working at academic medical centers, the single most common type of research that was conducted was a retrospective chart review. 55–60% of all the research done in the academic medical centers where I worked were these retrospective chart reviews, where a physician typically, but sometimes nurses, other PhD researchers would request permission from an ethical review board called an institutional review board, and or the privacy officer of the organization, to receive permission to conduct research on electronic health records without a person's consent. And this is actually permissible under the regulations. And it falls under the principle that it would be infeasible to conduct the research if the researcher needed to reach out to every single person and receive affirmative permission to conduct the research. And many countries have the same principle. It's really about how do we achieve the greater good? And in many cases, it's how do we achieve does the greater good to society by including someone's data without their permission create more overall benefit than the potential benefit to the individual after having given their explicit consent and permission for this use. So that is the current environment in which we exist, where it is necessary to include many people without their permission in research in order to have research that's sufficiently representative of the population that's being studied, and that we can generalize the results to future populations. So the challenge then is when there's profit too, the data are about patients. And so who should profit from this as well? So there's no easy answers. There's a lot of organizations that believe that they should profit. And I just wanted to point out to your audience in this slide that a lot of difficult decisions need to be made about how to distribute profit if you are choosing to do so. And these are different pricing and payment methods, such as how about a query? Do we pay a patient every time their data comes up in a query? Is that appropriate? Or even if use of data generates a new product, should the patient share in ownership of that product? Or how about in cost sharing? These are difficult questions, and currently in many forms of clinical research, the informed consent document specifies that an individual acknowledges that they will not receive profit from any future developments because no known developments may exist. And it could take 15 years for a company to use data that results in something that's actually a product that's profitable. Even when it's not that complicated, it's just worthwhile to ask this question about the horizontal value split and the vertical value split. A horizontal value split would mean that if you're using real world data, how would you split the profits among all of the contributors? So if patients should receive some, should you also give some money to the providers who made the diagnosis and entered value in the electronic health record system? How about the hospital in which the study was conducted or maintained the electronic health record system, or the insurer that paid for the visit? And
or the driver that drove him to the ambulance, or the nurse. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are participating in a patient's journey. And I think that's an interesting fact, because we kind of like focus in on the provider. The doctor gets paid through the insurer. Specific, processes are in place to ensure that the pharmacy gets paid and whatnot. But there's not I guess it's not so fair in some cases. But I think so. We probably try to make it as fair as possible with the tools that we have. But I think those tools are getting better, and I think we have to keep up with that innovation.
I agree. Or how about the pharmaceutical company that purchases this data in order to make a huge investment in trying to develop a product? So these are just difficult questions to ask. It's not nearly so straightforward as to say, hey, this information is about a patient. The patient should receive some profit. I think that's a legitimate argument. So if you would do so, then how would you do so?
Yeah,
and how many of the other parties involved in the data creation should also receive some remuneration? Or even if we say, yes, we are going to find a way to give patients some compensation, then we would also need to think of a vertical value split. Do you provide more compensation to the patients who generate data that have higher quality, or that generate more data and have more visits? How do you then create it to as fair?
Yeah, and another point to make, this is sort of on the ethical side of this ethical dilemma. What if the patient is getting paid like per visit or something, and then they sort of game the system and are having more visits that they don't need in order to get paid? So there's this like ethical situation that we're in potentially in that case. So these all have to be considered very carefully.
Yeah, I don't have any answers, but I hope that bringing up these slides and talking about these issues helps create more awareness about how complex this system is. And I do admire, that there are a number of marketplaces emerging where the goal is to provide patients with more remuneration. And Ablema is a good example. Nokia, together with Equidium Health, is creating a marketplace with the goal of compensating individuals. It's hard to know what it will take for some of those emerging marketplaces to be sufficiently competitive in order to get enough market share to be profitable. But at the same time, I'm encouraged that we're seeing organizations recognize that this data ultimately come from patients and that patients should receive some compensation if their data are resulting in commercial profit.
Very interesting. So I want to jump a little bit. I know that you
Mhm.
also are an editor and you put together a
Yeah.
fantastic book
Oh,
called
thank you.
Blockchain in Life Sciences. And you kind of outlined what that means, definitions. You also have many other collaborators on that book. So I
Mhm.
really do appreciate that you put it all together. And I read, parts of it, and I saw the
Well,
forward
thank
by
you.
Sean Mannion, who's also a great friend in the industry. And yeah, so the question is, how are blockchain technology, distributed ledger technologies, and Web3, how are they going to change this real world data landscape?
So
Or
that's
are they
a,
going to change it? Yeah.
I definitely believe so. And we are seeing that the blockchain industry and community is rapidly evolving. We're going to see some ups and downs. There are some progresses that are scaled back, but overall, we're seeing an expansion of blockchain. And even through 2020, the 70% of life sciences organizations stated that they were implementing one or more blockchain. Forbes predicted that for healthcare, that by 2025, 55% of healthcare apps would involve some blockchain among their architecture. So
Wow.
we're definitely seeing expansion. So it's probably helpful to provide just a tiny overview of blockchain for your audience, for those who are
Please.
not familiar. So blockchains come in many different shapes, sizes, orientations, different forms of incentives. It's important to know that blockchains have certain core features. So among them are that they're based on the principle that data are managed on a ledger instead of a database, which we are most familiar with, especially in pharmaceutical research. So on a ledger, it acts a lot more like an audit trail. But anytime there's an activity, you just add another line to reflect the nature of that activity. The next component is it uses cryptography in ways deeper than is customary for traditional data. Data activities go through a hash algorithm where an alphanumeric hash is generated of a certain length. That's the same length regardless of the activity that goes into it. And it involves an asymmetric encryption process where you cannot reverse engineer to figure out what the input was. And the last core feature that's similar to all these products is that the storage is distributed in some way so that you do not have a single point of failure like a central database. There may be multiple servers involved so that you have some replication and sharing among those servers. So those are some of the core features of blockchain. Now, many people who are familiar with the earliest versions of blockchain may think about blockchain as being just an audit trail that offers some transparency. And that is an important feature of blockchain, but blockchains have also evolved to involve more privacy and permissioning to manage data in different ways than we had before. So blockchain really is no longer just an audit trail. It can also be used as a data engine, and managing automation and the capability of rules with much more sophistication than we traditionally would hard code in an architecture stack. And we're seeing all kinds of variations on a continuum of decentralization. That some decentralization is not any single thing. There, in some estimations, up to 9 dimensions of decentralization. And so blockchains may have some features that are very decentralized, such as distribution of the data, but some features that are very centralized, such as management of the data to meet regulatory requirements. Or it could be the funding is done in a centralized way. So Another thing that's helpful to know, and serving on IEEE committees, that we were all supposed to be blockchain experts, and we had these bitter hour-long debates on the definition of blockchain. There's actually a joke in the blockchain community that if you ask 10 different experts for a definition of blockchain, you'll receive 11 different responses. So that just leads into the concept that I was sharing, that blockchain is evolving. And, nobody put me in charge of the definition of blockchain, and likewise, no one else is in charge. So what we're really seeing is, instead of any single definition emerging, we're seeing that the industry is using a distributed ledger in different ways. And there's tens of thousands of private permissioned distributed ledger technologies that are calling themselves blockchain. And so, just like with the English language, the definition of blockchain is evolving to be more inclusive and more expansive. And so it's just valuable to be open-minded about what the future can hold. Now, along those lines, how is this affecting Web3? Blockchain technology is estimated to manage about 80% of what we consider to be Web3. That's probably helpful for me to provide a quick definition of Web3 too. So
Sure. Yeah.
the first version of the internet, when it was first established in like 1991, 92, that it became commercially available, publicly available, the only thing that we could do when we logged into the internet was to look at websites. So that was considered Web 1 or Web 1.0, is that we could only read what was on the internet. Over time, the internet evolved so that individuals could participate with the content, that we could submit content, we could post information, we could send and receive files, and it became a much more interactive and bi-directional technology. And so that's, looking backward, that's what we call Web 2.0, where we can read and write capabilities. And now the definition of Web3 starts, there's some controversy as whether this is started in 2018 or 2020. But it's that as we are using more distributed technologies, that the storage is becoming distributed, and therefore the capabilities, management, control, and overall ownership of data is also changing. So this Web3 is reflecting that it's becoming that individuals are also gaining ownership to the information that they have or post, and that individuals then can be more responsible for profits or for maintaining the intellectual property of the content that they post, instead of immediately losing the ownership of content that's published on, say, blog sites in some ways, and preventing others from using it. So as we look at Web3, we are seeing a much greater movement toward individual visibility and control. And that, I believe that resonates really well with some of the movements in real world data too, as individuals can also gain more visibility and control over how their information is used.
Incredible. Thanks for explaining that Web 1, 2, and 3 as well. That's, definitely appreciate your time right now. And I think the audience does as well. So my next question is, so can you tell us more about some of the applications in life sciences, or how life sciences companies are using Web3 or blockchain?
Yeah. I'll give examples of both. So I think the first practical example that gained more widespread acceptance was using blockchain to manage the drug supply chain. And it was really encouraging when the FDA itself participated in 2 major pilots of organization consortia that got together to try to use blockchain to manage the drug supply chain. Those of you not familiar, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act takes effect November of this year, where pharmacies have to track package level product from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. And it requires just a much more detailed method of management over drugs. The hope is too that it can reduce the likelihood of diversion and help better manage recalls. So blockchain works so wonderfully as a ledger for supply chain that it's a very promising technology for managing drug supplies. Similarly, for devices, blockchain works really well in managing the device life cycle. And we're seeing more and more blockchains underlying the serial number tracking on devices so that they can also manage recalls more effectively and manage patient information more effectively. I am encouraged too in clinical research that the smart contracts that can automate that can execute automatically when certain conditions are met are being used to compensate research participants. And that if an individual performs the exercise that they are required to do or fills out the surveys that they're required to do on periodic basis, that they can receive compensation more quickly and to help maintain that engagement. And it's just using this technology in a way to automate some of the activities that were often expensive and manual. The area that I am most passionate about, though, when it comes to uses of Web3 and blockchain for life sciences research involves dynamic consent.
Dynamic consent. Okay.
And so dynamic consent is the principle that when you agree to participate in a study or in a repository or agree to allow an organization to use your data, that your agreement isn't forever. That an individual has the capability for providing more specific uses. We call it granular consent or fine-grained consent, where they have choices like toggle switches and say, you can use my data for immunology research, but maybe not for oncology research, or maybe not for other types of research. And to be able to log back in and change their minds if their views on research changes, where they realize the potential benefits of research and they want to become more involved. Today, 84% of the United States, of adults in the United States, own a smartphone. And so we're no longer limited by some of the technology limitations that reduced people's ongoing engagement. And now that we have blockchain capabilities that can track and automate permissions all the way down, what many life sciences organizations are doing is they're adding a layer of blockchain on top of their existing repository system or data management system to help manage the permissions in a much more effective way. And so now we actually have the technology capability in order to succeed in offering patients, really, I think it's a more ethical method of participation in saying that, we understand that we're asking a lot from you to participate in the study and give your permission for us to collect blood that we're going to store in a repository, and we're going to do DNA testing in the future, but we have no idea what we're going to test for. Well, because we know that medical research is evolving faster than we can even imagine, it's difficult to ask somebody for permission to conduct types of research that we can't even predict. And so then how can they give a meaningful agreement when we don't know what the future will hold? So the belief with dynamic consent is using technology capabilities to maintain a relationship with someone so that they remain more in control of their information, and that they can change their preferences as their life circumstances change or their opinions change about something. And that way they feel like we know that way that we have a better sense that their agreement remains more authentic.
Yeah, I like that. And not only do they have more control, but they also maybe have more awareness and education about the current medical research happenings in the world or in the country that they live in. So I think that's really great. And I think the drug supply chain applications and will probably get adopted sooner than like the patient consent ones, mainly because there's less regulation around the drug supply chain in terms of patient consent and data. So
yeah, but don't sell the dynamic consent short either, because we at BurstIQ have been implementing that for some of our customers for the last couple of years. It's just a matter of companies thinking about data differently and thinking about their relationships with research participants differently, and utilizing technology in ways that are more progressive so that they can, in a very forward-thinking perspective, create a different relationship and a more engaged relationship with their research participants that they believe is ultimately going to be more ethical and I believe in many cases more informed. So,
Excellent. On that note, Dr. Wendy Charles, I just
okay.
want to thank you so much for your time and explaining to us real world data, how that applies to blockchain and Web3. I always enjoy talking to you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for inviting me, Ray. And I hope that the audience was able to take away some of my perspectives.
Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we conclude here?
Well, you mentioned my book. If the audience is interested in learning more about blockchain and life sciences, you can find this book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble online. It was published by Springer Nature, and we've just been thrilled with how many people have told us, the group of authors, that they found this book to be really instructive, that it doesn't just provide information, it provides detailed instructions about how life sciences organizations could actually move forward with using blockchain more responsibly.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. Talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you.